Today we're going to be practicing converting equations from point-slope form into slope-intercept form and then into standard form. This is somewhat a review of our last lesson, but we're going to start with the first part here where we're given the slope and we're given 1 point. And because we have both of these, we can put it into point-slope form where we're just plugging in numbers. We plug in the slope to the m, we put the opposite of the x here, and the opposite of the y here. We did this in the previous lesson, just as review. So when we plug in the slope into point-slope form, we're going to take the opposite of the y, which is 5, so we have y minus 5, equals the slope, which is 6/5, times the difference of x, and then it would be a negative 10, but since we want the opposite of that, it's going to be plus 10. Now we're going to take it one step farther, and we're going to convert this into slope-intercept form, which is basically solving for y. You want y by itself. This is y equals mx plus b. To do that, first we're going to take our equation and do the distributive property. So we're going to multiply 6/5 times x, and we're going to multiply 6/5 times 10. Don't let the fraction freak you out. When we have 10, we're just going to put it over 1. And most of the time, these are going to cross cancel very nicely for you. And this is going to just be 12. So when we do the distributive property, we have y minus 5 equals 6/5 x. And then 6/5 times 10 is 12. So that gets rid of the fraction for the y-intercept. Only one step left now is we have to get the y by itself by moving the 5 to the other side by adding 5 on both sides. So we're going to get y equals 6/5 x plus 17. Let's try this again. First, we're going to plug in the numbers into point-slope form. So when we do that, for the first part, y minus y, we're going to do the opposite of the y, so we're going to have plus 4, equals the slope, which is -3, and then we have x minus 9. Again, to put this into slope-intercept form, we want to solve for y. First step is to do the distributive property. So we're going to multiply the -3 times x, and the -3 times the -9, and that would give us y plus 4 equals -3x plus 27. One step left to do. We want to take this 4, move it to the other side, and add it with the like terms on the other side. So we subtract 4 on both sides. And when you do that, the 4's cancel out, and you're left with y equals -3x plus 23. Again, let's try this. We're going to plug in numbers into our point-slope form. So that would be y minus 6 equals a slope of 3/7, and then x minus 14. To take it into slope-intercept form, we want to solve for y. So our first step is to do the distributive property. So we have 3/7 times x, and then we have 3/7 times a -14. And if we put that over 1, again, you can see that the cross-canceling makes this easy. So you just have 3 times a -2 on top, which is a -6. So when we do the distributive property, we have 3/7 x and -6. Again, we want to get the y by itself, so if we add 6 to both sides, in this particular case, both of those cancel out, and you're left with just y equals 3/7 x. Another practice, we're going to plug this into slope-intercept form. So we plugged in the slope here, the opposite of the y here, the opposite of the x there. So we have y minus 1 equals 8 times the sum of x plus 3. Now we're going to do the distributive property and multiply 8 times x and 8 times 3. When we do that, we get y minus 1 equals 8x plus 24. One step left to go is to get the y by itself, is to move the 1 to the other side by adding 1 on both sides. And when you do that, you get y equals 8x plus 25. Again, we're going to plug this into point slope form because that's what they give us. They give us the point and a slope. When we do that, we plug in the 4 for the slope, the opposite of the y, the opposite of the x, and there it is in point slope form. To put it into slope intercept form, we're going to do the distributive property. When we do that, we have 4 times x and 4 times negative 2. That gives us y minus 5 equals 4x minus 8. To get y by itself, we are now going to move the 5 to the other side by using our inverse operations. And we get y equals 4x minus 3. This is just more practice where we plugged in the numbers to the point slope form. To do the distributive property, we're going to do the 1/3 times the x and the 1/3 times the 3, which again works out very nicely when you do 1/3 times 3 over 1. Everything cancels out and it's just plus 1. So we have y minus 1 equals 1/3 x plus 1. We have to move the 1 to the other side using inverse operations. So we're going to add 1 to both sides. So we would have y equals 1/3 x plus 2. The last step we're going to do is we're going to take it one step farther. Now we're going to take it and we want to write it in standard form. In standard form, you want the x term first on the left side, followed by the y term on the left side, the equal sign, and then the constant is over here by itself on the right side. Well, we have to think, what do we start with? Well, they're giving us the slope and a point, so we have to start with point slope form. So when we plug in those numbers to point slope form, we have y minus 5 equals a negative 3/4 x, and then we have plus 8. Same steps we've been practicing. We're now going to do the distributive property. Again, we're going to have a negative 3/4 times 8. If we put that 8 over 1, again, it cross cancels very nicely and gives us a negative 6. So we have y minus 5 equals negative 3/4 x minus 6. To get y by itself, we add 5 to both sides. When you do that, you get y equals negative 3/4 x minus 1. Now the next step is putting it into standard form. Again, we want the x term here as the first term on the left. Well, here's the x term. All we have to do is move it from there and put it here in the first position. When you move something from one side to the other, we use inverse operations, which changes its sign. So since this is a negative 3/4 x, we will have to add 3/4 x to both sides. So that just moves it over here to the front as 3/4 x. We still have the y term on the left side, and the constant is still over here. So the only thing we had to move was the x term to the front of the other side by changing its sign. Now, in standard form, you cannot have a fraction. So we have to get rid of this denominator of 4. It's very simple to do. Whatever the denominator is, we're going to multiply all 3 terms by that denominator. So since we have the fraction 3/4, if we were to multiply all 3 terms by 4, 4 divided by 4 equals 1. So now you're left, that cancels out and you're left with 3x. Here you have 4 times a 1y, which is just a positive 4y, equals 4 times negative 1, which is negative 4. This is standard form. Again, you're just moving things from the left side to the right side, but there is that last step of having to get rid of the fraction. So let's look at this again. First, we're going to start with point slope form because that's what they give us, the slope and a point. When we plug in those numbers, we get y minus 2 equals 7 times the difference of x minus 1. Now we do the distributive property, 7x, and then 7 times negative 1, which is negative 7. So we have y minus 2 equals 7x minus 7. To get y by itself, we have to move the 2 to the other side of the equation using our inverse operations. When we do that, we get y equals 7x minus 5. Now, again, to move it into standard form, the x term is the only term that we have to move. We want it in the front of the other side. When we move it to the other side, we use our inverse operations, which changes the sign from a positive 7x to a negative 7x. Everything else stays the same. Now, in the last slide, we said that in standard form that you can have a fraction. In standard form, we also do not like the leading coefficient. The leading coefficient would be the number in front of the x to be a negative. So we want to get rid of the negative in front of the 7. Well, if we were to divide all 3 terms by a negative 1, all that happens is it changes the sign of each term. So now instead of a negative 7x, we have a positive 7x. Instead of a positive y, we have a negative y. And instead of a negative 5, we have a positive 5. So when you get to this point and this leading coefficient is negative, all you have to do is change the sign on each 3 terms, which is like dividing each term by a negative 1. When you do that, then you have it written in standard form. So let's try this one. First, we're going to write it in point slope form. So we plug in the numbers, and you would have y plus 1 equals negative 1 times the difference of x minus 3. We do the distributive property. So we're going to do the negative 1 times x and the negative 1 times the negative 3. That gives us y plus 1 equals a negative x plus a positive 3. We want to get rid of the 1 on this side, so we're going to subtract 1 on both sides. That's going to give us y equals negative x plus 2. Now again, to put it in standard form, all we have to do is move the x from this position to the front of the left side by changing its sign. So we're going to do a positive x on both sides. When we do that, you have x plus y equals 2. Now this is standard form. There are no fractions, and the leading coefficient is a positive 1, even though it's invisible. So at this point, we are finished. Let's try one more. When we plug in these numbers to point slope form, you would simply have y minus 1 equals 1/2 times the difference of x minus 3. The distributive property is going to give us a fraction, which we don't like, but as the constant over here, we have a negative 3/2. When you think about it, that's just a negative 1.5 or a negative 1 5/10. Now to get y by itself, we want to add a positive 1 to both sides. So if you have one negative and one positive, we subtract and keep the sign of the one with the greatest absolute value. So 1.5 minus 1 whole would be a half. Keep the sign of the one with the greatest absolute value, so that would just give us negative half when we move that 1 to both sides, from one side to the other. Now to put it in standard form, we have to move the x term to the front. When we do that, it's going to be a negative 1/2 x. Well, there's 2 things here we do not want to have in standard form. First, we have the leading coefficient is negative, and it is a fraction. So we need to multiply all 3 terms by a negative 2. By multiplying it by a negative 2, this cancels out and you have a positive x. You have negative 2 times y, which is minus 2y. And then you have a negative 2, which is negative 2 over 1, times negative 1/2. These all cancel out, and you're left with a positive 1. So in standard form, that would simply be x minus 2y equals 1. Standard form, no fractions, and the leading coefficient right here needs to be positive, and that is an imaginary or an invisible 1x. That is our lesson for today.